Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Andy's YouTube Food Skepticism. Today's episode is Reactive Hypoglycemia, also called the Herald of Diabetes. Hence, I've got like a little herald angel on the side there blowing its trumpet or whatever that is. I don't really know wind instruments. I'm a piano guy, but whatever. So, a little roadmap of what we're going to be talking about. Well, first, we're going to define what reactive hypoglycemia is. Next, I want to discuss some fun facts related to it. I wanted to show you what a proper insulin response looks like, and then what a poor insulin response would look like, and how that's related to reactive hypoglycemia. Next, we're going to discuss the etiology or the origin of it. Uh, you know, Spoiler alert, we don't know, but we have some ideas. And risk factors. We'll discuss those as well as the implications, and I'll even talk about some medical nutrition therapy or the kind of advice you'd get if you went and saw a registered dietitian for reactive hypoglycemia. So, reactive hypoglycemia is defined when your blood glucose falls below your normal blood sugar after eating. Now, why I say your normal is because it's not true hypoglycemia where your blood sugar drops below 70 milligrams per deciliter, which we'll talk about in a second. It's just signs and symptoms that are so similar to it. That's why it's called a herald of it. It's also known as postprandial hypoglycemia. Postprandial basically just means after a meal. Postprandial after meal. It's also known as carbohydrate intolerance and postprandial syndrome. Up to date, which is actually like a physician reference, they use it in hospitals all the time, warns that it's a descriptor, not a disease itself. So, what we're talking about is a syndrome or a descriptor of symptoms that we observe, but we haven't nailed down that it's a disease by itself. Okay, so some fun facts. I promised you they'd be fun. I'll do my best. But so again, because it's reactive hypoglycemia, not true hypoglycemia, it occurs with people whose blood sugar is above 70 milligrams per deciliter. So it's normal from a blood sugar standpoint, but obviously you have these symptoms, so something's not right. Um, Now, because it's not true hypoglycemia, people with diabetes know of something called the 15-15 rule for treating it, which basically just means if you have true hypoglycemia, you've measured your blood sugar. People with diabetes, they know, oh, these are my symptoms of hypoglycemia. I test my blood sugar. If it shows that the blood sugar is low, you take 15 grams of carbohydrate, like a fast acting carbohydrate, to get that blood sugar back up in a hurry because hypoglycemia, true hypoglycemia, is considered an emergency. So you do that, you wait 15 minutes, then see where your blood sugar's at, and then you keep administering 15 grams of carbohydrate and waiting 15 minutes until your blood sugar gets back up to normal. But you're not going to do any of that with reactive hypoglycemia because it's not true hypoglycemia. Now, I didn't know that. Now, once I had reactive hypoglycemia, and I'll tell you, I had all the shakiness and the sweatiness and everything, and it was crazy. And I didn't know what was happening because I didn't have a glucometer with me to test my blood sugar. So my instinct was, well, this seems like hypoglycemia. Maybe I'll just take a bunch of carbohydrate and see what happens. So, of course, I went and ate like a million pieces of candy. I was definitely not following the 15-15 rule, but it was delicious. Anyway, it's all reactive hypoglycemia is considered a type of early glucose intolerance, and it often progresses to type 2 diabetes mellitus. So it's something we want to avoid is that progression. So again, we don't know what causes it. We believe it's associated with poor phase 1 insulin response. I'll show you what that is on the next slide. And it's associated with an exaggerated phase 2 response. Um, it's also related to something called dysinsulinism, which refers to chronically high insulin levels. Now, why would you have chronically high insulin levels? Well, perhaps if you have a pancreatic tumor, or if you're constantly, raising your blood sugar and spiking it with these high sugary snacks, and you're not eating complete balanced meals, you're just eating nothing but high carb and things like that, you might have that happen. So in a normal insulin response, you see here, uh, phase one, you're going to have this sudden insulin release that corresponds to the sudden spike in blood sugar, right? So that's the top of that arch you see. And then it kind of levels out and levels out, and the second phase is more or less like a steady, slow release of insulin to kind of fine tune your blood sugar and bring it back to normal. Now, what happens in the case of poor insulin response is this first spike in insulin doesn't really happen. It's a rather poor response. So it's a lot lower. You have much less insulin being released. The body sort of realizes what's happening and goes, oh boy, I really got to increase my insulin. So your phase two, instead of being this really level, even release of insulin, you get another spike, so to speak, but a real spike. And we think that's what causes the sudden spike at the phase two that suddenly drops your blood sugar back to normal. We think that's related to reactive hypoglycemia. All right, another slide. It's the same, it's just illustrating what's happening. Okay, so lifestyle, repeated insulin spikes, right? From repeated blood sugar spikes, or from a pancreatic tumor or whatever. Um, if you've had a gastrectomy or a bypass, people who are trying to lose weight or something will often have like a gastric bypass and shrinks the stomach size or whatever. Um, so what happens is they have a lot because they can't. The stomach doesn't act as big of a well to store carbohydrate. It tends to empty a little bit quicker into the small intestine, and so you have more of that blood sugar spike. But not necessarily if you're eating normal meals and you've had a gastric bypass. By the way, just in case you're curious, gastrectomy, gastro refers to the stomach, ectomy refers to cutting out part of it. So you're really cutting out part of the stomach. That's what gastrectomy means. Anyway, genetic factors, there is something called the HERG mutation, which we think might be related. It's also important to note that people with a family history of type 2 diabetes, or especially reactive hypoglycemia, much more likely to have reactive hypoglycemia. And progression may be prevented with diet. As the Mayo Clinic says, dietary changes are recommended and very important. Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, so what would you get medical nutrition therapy wise if you went to the dietitian? Well, their primary goal would be to stabilize your glucose levels. And that's done by avoiding these big meals that hit your gut with a ton of carbohydrate at once. So you're going to have these smaller meals more frequently. It's something that bodybuilders love. And it's something that maybe people who are trying to lose weight or people who are trying to control their reactive hypoglycemia should adopt. You want to limit your carbohydrated snacks to 1 to 2 carbohydrate exchanges. Now, what is an exchange? Well, if you're somebody with diabetes, you've probably heard of the diabetes exchange list. One exchange is equal to about 15 grams of carbohydrate, so 2 exchanges is 30. So limit your snacks to 15 to 30 grams of carbohydrates if you can. It's like the equivalent of an apple or something. And you'll also want to limit your meal carbohydrate generally to 4 to 5 exchanges. So multiplying 4 by 15, we get about 60. So 60 to 75 grams of carbohydrate per meal is 4 to 5 exchanges, which is plenty. And you will notice if you ever try to eat that, you're like, you're really trying to stuff yourself. But that's with a balanced meal. So 4 to 5 carb exchanges by itself may go down the gullet rather easily. Too easily, in fact. You'll want to ensure a balanced plate. There's something called the satiety index, which also controls the rate of release of food from your stomach into your small intestine. And essentially, what that means is like certain foods like protein and fat have a higher satiety index. They tend to also be a slower release of energy. They require more effort by your stomach to break down and release. So it's good for your blood sugar. It's good for your hunger levels. Eat a balanced plate, guys. Protein, carb, and healthy fats. You'll want to avoid high glycemic foods, especially if you're on an empty stomach. So don't be going and having that giant soda if you haven't had a meal. That's probably going to aggravate any um, reactive hypoglycemia you have. They say to limit caffeine. I think part of that is to avoid the signs and symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia. So if you drink a ton of caffeine, everybody knows this. They've had those periods where you drank too much and all of a sudden you're sweating and you're shaky and the whole mess, and maybe you get a headache from it later or whatever. So we don't want to confuse high caffeine symptoms or caffeine crashes with the signs and symptoms of reactive hypoglycemia. So that's why they say people who suspect it, limit your caffeine. So you're not confusing the two. And as always, moderate alcohol intake with food. With food. If you drink on an empty stomach, a lot of problems with that. It may be more economical, but you're going to have a lot of problems. And I might discuss that in a later PowerPoint because a lot of people would probably be interested in that. Anyway, so 4 takeaways. One, it's idiopathic. We don't know what's going on, but we have our ideas. We believe it's caused by insulin phase dysfunction. And carbohydrate management is the key to prevention, and weight loss may be required. Here are some references, and as always, if you like this video, why not show it? Hit like. If you like this video and you want to see more, just hit subscribe. It'll notify you. Thank you very much. Please leave any comments or questions in the comment section below.